Hi, everyone. Welcome back, assuming you're coming back, to the Physionic Podcast. If you're not familiar with who I am, as usual, I like to introduce myself real quick so you understand that you're not getting information from some random guy on the internet, although maybe that's still the case. My name is Nicholas Verhoeven. I'm a PhD student in molecular medicine, and that's probably going to be the qualification that I'm going to be basing hopefully a lot of information on. I'm going to be going through a topic that I know is extremely prevalent for a lot of people, which is depression. So I'm going to be talking to you about nutrition consequences of depression, but also a few different things, a few different nutrition protocols that have been shown in the scientific literature to be beneficial combating depression. Now, I also really like to focus on physiology and things of that nature, so it's going to be a wide-ranging podcast today because we're going to be discussing certainly depression, but we're going to go into the mechanisms of depression. We're going to go into what are some of the associations with, for example, like inflammation. What are some of the associations with oxidative stress? And I'll be explaining what those are, as well as mitochondrial dysfunction. Now, the big thing here is that this is a pretty far-reaching topic, and I will be breaking this up into several different episodes. So this first episode is discussing those 3 points. So discussing inflammation, oxidative stress, and mitochondrial dysfunction. If you are watching the podcast, although it is absolutely not required, if you are listening, you are perfectly fine. But if you are watching, I have a series of different graphics to help you kind of grasp some of the concepts that I'll be going over. And hopefully it'll help in terms of actually visualizing some of the things that I'll be mentioning. And as usual, kind of at the end, I'll have kind of a big takeaway that we can glean from this. And the next episodes are going to be covering BDNF, so brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and neurogenesis, which is the overall growth of the brain, growth of different neurons, the interaction therein, the HPA axis, which is called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and gut microbiota, and how those 3 affect depression. And then I will probably have another episode after that, actually, where I talk about maternal and paternal food consumption on epigenetics. Now, I just released actually a video on epigenetics and how food consumption in the fathers can change the epigenetic makeup of the father's sperm cells that then get passed on to their kids. So I'll be going more into that, and then also going into obesity's relationship to depression, as well as a bit on tryptophan metabolism. So it's kind of, like I said, it's wide-reaching in terms of a lot of different areas, a lot of different avenues, but I'm going to be breaking it down really in the nitty-gritty. So we're going to go down to a cell. We're going to go down to understanding within the cell. I'm going to cover a bit of a particular molecular mechanism that could be causing some of these issues. So there's a lot to get into. If you would like a visual, then hop on over to the video version of this podcast. And like I said, I won't remind you again, but you don't actually have to watch it. You can get all this information just by listening, because I'll be describing things as best as possible. Okay, so a lot of this information is going to be coming from a review called Diet and Depression, Exploring the Biological Mechanisms of Action. And this review actually is published in a pretty big journal. I believe it was posted on Nature, but the actual journal that this was put in was Molecular Psychiatry. So there's a lot we're going to be covering throughout this review, and that's why I've had to split it up into a series of different podcasts. Okay, so studies have shown in the past that nutrition intervention can have a small effect when it comes to depression symptoms. And other studies have shown much greater effects when it comes to depression, when depression is more severe. So it may be kind of a baseline issue that if you don't suffer from depression, maybe it doesn't have that dramatic of an impact. If you have kind of mild depression, if you can characterize depression as mild, then it might have a little bit of an impact. But if you truly have like major depressive disorder, maybe nutrition could have pretty substantial effects in terms of improving those symptoms. So, and as one example is the Mediterranean diet has been reported to lead to significant reductions in depressive symptoms. And we'll go into that. And so this review focuses on the possible mechanisms for why these dietary intervention leads to these benefits, and how also, on top of that, also how nutrition can affect depression, how it can potentially affect depression. So again, a lot of mechanisms. So the first thing is to look at inflammation. Remember, I'm going to be breaking it up into 3 different sections. So this inflammation, there's an association between an increased level of inflammation and mood disorders in some cases. So mood disorders not being necessarily just depression, could be like bipolar disorder as well, or seasonal affective disorder, which is certainly going to be quite prevalent nowadays, now that we're getting deeper into November and then going into December and January. That's where it tends to pop up quite a bit. So you have this association between increased levels of inflammation and these different mood disorders. And again, that's just in some cases, because there is going to be a lot of individuality. So inflammatory molecules like cytokines and prostaglandins can influence these mood disorders by changing the neurotransmitters that are emitted from neurons. So what exactly does that mean? Well, your brain is filled with cells, just like anything else. Your brain isn't just filled with cells, it is made up of cells. It is a tissue made up of cells. And these cells, specifically the neurons, allow for this communication between one part of the brain and another part of the brain. And that's actually true for your entire nervous system. So the neurons communicate between one another. So if you have one neuron and then you have a second neuron, they're not connected in any way. They have a small gap between them, that this kind of junction that's between a section of neuron 1 and a section of neuron 2. So the part that communicates to the other neuron, let's say neuron 1 is trying to send a signal to neuron 2, neuron 1 has these projections called axons, and at the very end of these axons, they're like tails almost. At the very end of that tail is an axon terminal, and terminal because it's the end section of that axon. And here is where you get this sending of the signal. So the signal is being sent down the entire axon, and then it gets down to the axon terminal, the very end. And that's where an electrical signal gets translated into a chemical signal. And that chemical signal is done through neurotransmitters. These neurotransmitters are released from the axon of neuron 1, and then they bind particular receptors, like one receptor type is like a metabotropic receptor. I guess ultimately it doesn't really matter. The point is that it binds receptors on neuron 2, but specifically on these other projections that are part of neurons as well, called dendrites. So this communication between the axon of one neuron and the dendrite of another neuron allows for this propagation of signals. Now, why is that important? Well, I mean, if you're talking about anything that's related to the brain, if you're trying to get communication across the brain, you need to have these neurotransmitters that are being released and also being reuptaked. that's not exactly a word, but if you've ever heard of SSRIs, those are reuptake inhibitors. So they try and maintain neurotransmitters within that region between the axon and the dendrite, and trying to inhibit the reuptake of those neurons, or of those neurotransmitters, back into the neuron. So how inflammation can affect that, presumably, according to this review, is that these cytokines, which are released from inflammatory cells, and that's kind of where I kind of broke off from my line of thought earlier, but your brain isn't completely made up of neurons. It's actually made up of other cells as well. And some of those cells are immune cells. They are specific immune cells that are designated to the brain, like microglia. So these microglia will send out signals just like any other cell would through something like cytokines. So these cytokines can bind, let's say, neuron 1 that's trying to communicate to neuron 2, and will modulate the amount and lead to a change in the amount of neurotransmitter that's released. So you could have maybe less neurotransmitter. Maybe you could have too much neurotransmitter that's being released, and that can change the interaction, this chemical interaction between neuron 1 and neuron 2. Therefore, you are then changing the relationship between these different neurons. Therefore, that can also have an impact on your mood, because you have different regions of your brain that are highly necessary for mood. Think of like the amygdala is a particular section, and there's a lot of crosstalk between different sections of the brain. So the point being that these inflammatory cells are releasing inflammatory signals that are binding these neurons and therefore changing the function of these neurons, or how they're functioning. You can also have neuroendocrine changes, which are more widespread. So if you're talking about endocrine, you're talking about hormone changes, and that can all change brain activity. So, for example, one good example of this is interferon alpha. Interferon alpha causes changes in emotions and behavior, like promoting low mood, so tending to be more dejected, not being quite as happy. Fatigue can also increase anxiety, and can also increase cognitive dysfunction. But on the other hand, the consumption, because the consumption of NSAIDs, which are non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, which are like your ibuprofens, have been showing, and other anti-inflammatory drugs seem to have an effect that is additive to different treatments for depressive disorders. So what does that ultimately mean? Well, that they've shown, at least based on this review and the studies that they've reviewed, is that when people are taking antidepressants and then they add on top of that things that end up decreasing the inflammation throughout the body, it seems to also have a beneficial role to reduce inflammation. So they're consuming not only their antidepressant, but they're also consuming NSAIDs. Now, of course, there are contraindications to that, because NSAIDs can have negative effects in other ways. But specifically for the focus of NSAIDs on depressive disorders, there seems to be an association with decreasing depressive disorder with NSAID consumption. That is not to say, I don't want you walking away from this thinking that if you just consume NSAIDs, you're just going to be cured from depression. It's not that simple, as we will see. Another point is that a healthy diet might also reduce inflammation. That is not a shock at all. If you are consuming a typical Western diet where you're consuming a lot of fats, you're consuming a lot of saturated fats, you're consuming all kinds of, let's say, high fructose corn syrup, whatever it might be, and especially in overconsumption of these things, then you typically have increases in inflammation. If you're massively overweight, if you have metabolic syndrome, which is something I'll touch on again later, then typically you have higher levels of inflammation. Now, that's not always across the board that's going to be the case, but generally that's the case. So if inflammation is an issue for you, like having metabolic syndrome, in that situation, something like a Mediterranean diet, which is kind of a nice mixture of different things. And that's why they've shown in other studies that the Mediterranean diet does seem to have a protective effect against depression and tends to reverse some of the depressive symptoms. Again, don't walk away from this thinking that just changing your diet is immediately going to lead to you just eviscerating all depressive symptoms. But the point is that it can help. And it can help, obviously, improve general health outcomes, which, of course, then reduces your inflammation. So if we're creating this link between inflammation and depressive symptoms, that makes sense. So studies have also shown that in people with severe mental illness tend to have much higher levels of inflammation from higher intakes of refined sugars and trans fats. And trans fats is no shock whatsoever. I mean, that's why I don't actually know if they've banned them already. I think that they have. I believe the FDA has already banned trans fats. They had like certain grace period where companies could start to phase them out of their products, but trans fats were just generally just terrible for our health. It might seem kind of counterintuitive because a trans fat is technically an unsaturated fat. And you always hear, unsaturated fats, they're great for you. But this particular unsaturated fat was just straight terrible. So it did lead to increases in inflammation. Exactly the mechanisms for how, I'm not entirely sure. That's something I'd like to look into as well as with refined sugars. And lower intakes of whole foods also tended to lead to increase or be associated with increases in inflammation. So those with a more inflammatory dietary pattern tended to have a higher risk of developing depression over time. Which is, I mean, if that turns out to be true, if that turns out to be the case, and we end up seeing that has pretty massive implications. You're not just talking in that situation with that depression is just something that's being passed on genetically, or that it's something that's just something that happens to you. It could be in those situations, and it could be very particular to those people, that it can lead to depression. It's not because of just kind of an unfavorable situation. It could literally be the food, the molecules themselves in your food that could be changing the neurochemistry and therefore changing your ability to bounce back and to have that kind of neuroplasticity, that ability to be happier, to fend off depression. So that would be huge. I'd definitely love to read more into that because, to think more inflammatory dietary patterns like a Western diet tend to have higher risk of developing depression over time. I'm assuming that's probably an association, and that's not causative, but it's still really, really interesting. So some examples of components of a healthy diet, so things that'll actually maybe not reverse, but fight against this inflammatory effect and that effect on depression, is things like polyphenols. So you've got foods like blueberries. I always love saying it, cacao. So cacao, curcumin, which I have content on curcumin. Curcumin seems to have an impact on all kinds of different things. Diabetes was one of them in terms of beneficial impact on diabetes, protective effect against diabetes, but apparently it might also have a protective effect when it comes to depression. So who knew? We're learning more and more, as well as other anti-inflammatory nutrients like omega-3s. You've heard of taking like fish oils, for example. You're talking about like your docosahexamide. Nope, that's not exact. Docosahexapentanoic acid, something along those lines. I'm very close with that. But that is an omega-3. That's my point. And you've got a variety of them. You've got at least 3 of them that you can pick through, and they all have different effects. I actually have an article on the topic that's free, and I'll link that so that you can read over it. But the point is that you do have these fatty acids that make up these omega-3s, these particular polyunsaturated fats that then can have a positive effect against inflammation. And those all tend to be the most effective in people with high baseline depression. So again, going back to my original point of, well, maybe it's not just that if you have depression, if you have a little bit, as weird as that sounds to say you have a little bit of depression, that, changing your diet is immediately going to get rid of your depression. It seems to have the most impact on people that have high depressive symptoms, have strong depressive symptoms. Okay, so actually forgot to throw this up here, but for those who are watching, you've got these activated immune cells. So higher inflammation is associated with severe mental illness. But again, association, it's the same. It's correlation, doesn't mean causation. So it's something to keep in mind, though. Something to certainly investigate further in the future. Okay, so now let's move on to a little bit on oxidative stress. So oxidative stress is the imbalance of oxidative versus antioxidant processes that result in damage to intracellular molecules. So I'm going to break that down for you. So you have molecules, let's say proteins. Let's focus on proteins, although this is true for a lot of different molecules. You have proteins that serve a particular function. They have a particular shape. They do certain things, and they have this one job, or they have a multitude of jobs within your cell. And they are designed a certain way. Your cell has created them a certain way so that they do that one job, or they do maybe a few different jobs. Now, when a molecule like a free radical or a reactive oxygen species interacts with that functional protein, what it does is it can tear away at the structure. I'm trying to keep this without going into too much like chemistry, without going into too much chemistry. But this molecule, this free radical, will tear away at the structure, the integrity of that protein. So now that protein is just a little bit different. It's in certain cases, it can be a lot different. It can be incredibly changed, so that the structure of the protein is changed to a degree that it can no longer function the way that it was supposed to function. Now, that is certainly detrimental, the fact that a free radical could affect proteins, but remember I mentioned that it affects many molecules. It essentially affects every molecule in the cell. So we're talking proteins. We're also talking about fats, meaning that it could damage the cell membrane, the actual integrity of the cell, and could lead to that cell dying. And the big one, however, is DNA. So these reactive oxygen species and these free radicals, those are both kind of oxidative molecules, can damage DNA. And obviously, if you're damaging the DNA, you're getting right down to the crux of what the cell relies on to create these functional proteins. So then you get mutations. And with mutations, you get all kinds of other destructive things like cancer, or you get just the cell ends up recognizing that it can't maintain itself and it ends up dying. Okay, so a meta-analysis found an association between mental disorder, depression, and persistent oxidative stress. So higher levels of oxidative stress, kind of like what we were talking about with higher levels of inflammation, which those two, and this is a separate podcast, but those two are also linked. Higher oxidative stress, higher inflammation. So it's really not a huge shock to see this again, that you have higher levels of oxidative stress is also associated with certain mental disorders like depression. So interestingly, oxidative stress markers tend to decrease once people jump on antidepressants. So that gives us a little bit of information there. It kind of tells us that there may be an effect of antidepressants, depending on how the study's actually done, but that the antidepressants themselves could have a direct impact on something that is generating this oxidative stress, whatever that is. And I'll go into some of those mechanisms as to what causes that as we go further, especially once we get into the mitochondrial dysfunction. So these antidepressants, are they maybe targeting? Is it specifically what they're targeting that is decreasing the oxidative stress, or is it maybe through offshoot mechanisms, through off-target effects, that it's having a positive effect as well? So not just its main mechanism of the antidepressant, but maybe some other ways that it binds the cells and creates these different scenarios that reduce oxidative stress. Also, post-mortem studies show that, post-mortem being after death, studies show that there is elevated oxidative stress in the brains of people with depression, bipolar disorder, and other mental disorders. So I've read a little bit into this, that there are changes in metabolism, and metabolism is highly related to oxidative stress. Specifically fat metabolism, and I'll explain why in a little bit. That's not to say that fat is bad, just to be clear. But if you do have changes in metabolism, then maybe that is actually leading to greater levels of oxidative stress, or maybe you just have greater levels of inflammation. I mean, the point here is that there's so many different things that could be contributing to this, but the overall idea is that you're getting this oxidative stress, you're getting these molecules that are damaging the insides of our cells, and if you're talking about like neurons, if you're talking about those particular brain cells I was talking about earlier, that can lead to all kinds of aberrant behavior of those neurons. So diet, of course, can change oxidative stress levels. So, for example, a high-fat Western diet increases markers of oxidative stress. That's not a huge shock. A high-fat or high-calorie Western diet definitely would increase oxidative stress, but it also might increase inflammation. So you're getting a double effect there, in the brain as well as peripherally. And that doesn't seem like that much of a stretch to me. So some dietary intervention. So, how we talked about for inflammation, we talked about using like curcumin, blueberries, these different polyphenols and whatnot, omega-3s. So for oxidative stress, what this review mentions is that you want to consume certain nutrients, certain molecules and nutrients are the same thing, certain nutrients that have an antioxidant ability. At the very beginning of this particular section, I mentioned that there's an imbalance between oxidation and antioxidant processes. So antioxidant processes are literally molecules that I hesitate. I don't want to talk like I'm talking to I want to make sure that I'm doing justice to the topic without going way off on tangents discussing the chemistry. The point being that antioxidant molecules or nutrients can interact with those free radicals, can interact with those reactive oxygen species and neutralize them. They have a particular chemical structure that allows them to interact and sort of quiet down the reactiveness of these free radicals and these reactive oxygen species. So a few of those dietary interventions, a few of those molecules are vitamins, like vitamin C and vitamin E. Vitamin E, just because I'm not recommending anything in this podcast as a disclaimer, but in case you do run off with ideas, vitamin E is a fat-soluble vitamin. It is not something you want to consume in high doses. But the point being that if you are deficient, you haven't been consuming your vitamin E, it is something that you might want to look into. And those can play a direct role in scavenging free radicals. So those are antioxidants, therefore they search out, in a manner of speaking, those free radicals and eliminate them. Other ones are selenium, zinc, and an amino acid, cysteine. And this one was actually really interesting. I'd be interested in learning more on that. But those are all cofactors for different antioxidant systems like glutathione peroxidase and superoxide dismutase. Now, those are two kind of fancy words. The point is, your cells have protective mechanisms to literally generate molecules, to literally generate things, antioxidants that will deal with these free radicals that will inevitably occur over time. So these particular nutrients, selenium, zinc, and this particular cysteine, specifically N-acetylcysteine, are contributors that help in the production and the function of those inborn antioxidants. So vitamin C and vitamin E are antioxidants themselves. Those three that I mentioned with the amino acid help the cell use the cell's own antioxidant system to eliminate these different reactive oxygen species and whatnot. Okay, so, and then the final point that I wanted to touch on here is that there is some evidence with this cysteine supplementation, and I don't actually know, I should have looked into this, but I don't actually know if it's this specific formulation that's only the one that's effective, this N-acetylcysteine, or if just cysteine in general can be consumed and it has these improving depressive symptoms. So there's evidence that it does lead to improvement in depressive symptoms. If it's through this mechanism of an helping the antioxidant system, we don't know. We don't know, not based off of this information, but it could be. It easily could be. And the same was found with some polyphenols, which I mentioned a few earlier, that you can find in like blueberries, for example, by inducing. And here's where things get a little more molecular, inducing like signaling pathways like NRF2 and reducing NF-kappa B signaling, which can lead to pro-inflammatory signaling. So in this situation, again, I'm going to describe this, but just to look at one of these signaling mechanisms, just so you can be a little more familiar with this and how ridiculously complex this stuff can be sometimes. So you have a cell, and inside that cell, you have this fluid that is called the cytoplasm or the cytosol. We're going to, even though it's technically not entirely correct, we're going to call it the cytosol. And that is the vast majority of the cell, that section of the cell, the cytosol. And then you have another like envelope. You have another housing area called the nucleus. And in the nucleus, as if you're familiar with physiology, you know I've talked about this many times, and you likely already know this, that you have genes that encode, that have the information to produce different proteins. Some of those proteins, I'm going to limit this discussion, but some of those proteins can lead to more inflammation. Okay, so this nucleus is where particular proteins called these activating proteins that are found in the cytosol will move into the nucleus and bind the genes that it wants to express, to excite, to create more of that protein. So this translocation, that's what it's called, when a protein moves from the cytosol into, or cytosol, into the nucleus, that is a very selective process. Only certain proteins can do that. Only certain signaling molecules can do that. And then they bind to the DNA, to the gene, and lead that gene to be excited, not as in like a facial expression, but it leads the cell then to produce more of that gene, whatever's being read, that blueprint, like an architect reading a blueprint and then creating more of that molecule, of that protein. Okay, so that's a bit of background before I actually go into the cell signaling itself. Okay, so I mentioned that there were these signaling pathways called NRF2 and NF-kappa B. So I'm focused right now on NF-kappa B. So how this would work out. You have a cell, let's say a neuron. We'll focus this on the brain. You have this neuron, and it will be bound by, let's say, a cytokine. Or it can be, which is that communication protein from, in this case, one of the inflammatory cells, the immune cells. Or you can have some sort of reactive oxygen species that stimulates the cell to do this. But let's just focus on something binding a receptor on the outside of the cell. Then the receptor will change in a certain way that will allow for that signal from the outside to be translated to the inside of the cell. So now we're in the cytoplasm. Now the proteins in the that are floating in the cytoplasm, in the cytosol, will then lead to an activation of a protein called IKK. So IKK, which is a kinase protein, meaning that it will activate another protein by adding a phosphate to it. So this IKK protein gets excited or gets activated by the receptor that was bound by the cytokine, and then it will move or it will interact with this NF-kappa B protein. So this is where I'm kind of going full circle. So the NF-kappa B protein is being sequestered or being held, being anchored in the cytoplasm. Typically what it would do is it would move into the nucleus. It would translocate, just like I described earlier. But what is happening is it's bound by an inhibitory protein. So it's got like a really clingy significant other that's stuck to it and won't let it leave the house, won't let NF-kappa B move to the nucleus. So that protein, the inhibitory protein, is called I-kappa B. So I-kappa B is bound to NF-kappa B. And when IKK gets activated, it will move to this complex of I-kappa B plus NF-kappa B, and it will add phosphates, because again, it's a kinase, I told you. It will add phosphates to I-kappa B, and that addition of phosphates leads to this dissociation of I-kappa B from NF-kappa B. So now you have two separate proteins, and I-kappa B will then be degraded, will be destroyed, because it's been phosphorylated by IKK, and NF-kappa B is now free. So if it could yell, it would scream freedom, because now it can translocate to the nucleus and do what it's supposed to do. Okay, so once it moves into the nucleus, it will interact with other proteins that are called cofactors. Just that's a generic name, but cofactors, and will move to a particular gene. That gene will then be excited and be read. So that gene will be read into a protein, and that is initially started by a complex that's incredibly important called RNA polymerase. So RNA polymerase will start the process of creating this protein. There's other steps involved. So if you're a biologist, please understand that I understand that there's other steps that are involved. But the point being that you get this production of this protein. Now, what is that protein? Well, the protein can be other inflammatory proteins. So suddenly you're getting this cascade of, okay, we've got this inflammatory cytokine that binds the outside of the neuron. The neuron goes through this whole NF-kappa B situation. NF-kappa B gets freed up, and it's not exactly a great thing in this situation because it goes to the nucleus and recruits cofactors and RNA polymerase, and then produces another inflammatory protein. So then that gets secreted out of the neuron, and then that ends up attaching to other neurons, and the cycle obviously perpetuates itself. So That's a small taste. That's a small taste of how complex some of this stuff can. That's just one signaling pathway, and I definitely skimmed over it. I mean, there's a lot more involved in that pathway than what I just went over. But the point being that nutrition can reduce the levels of this NF-kappa B signaling, and that's not for you to walk away thinking that NF-kappa B is always bad. It's not. It's just in this context, it's not that great. Okay. So hopefully, if you were listening to this and you didn't look at the visual, I applaud you. Hopefully I explained that well enough. I don't feel like I'm at the top of my game today because certain words are eluding me. Like trying to describe the nucleus earlier was a bit of a struggle. But anyway, thanks for bearing with me. Okay, so we've discussed inflammation, we've discussed oxidative stress, and I'm really glad I didn't discuss all 9 of the different topics in this one podcast because I knew it was going to take forever just to cover even just these 3. Okay, so the next one the final one is mitochondrial dysfunction. So let's discuss mitochondrial dysfunction. This is actually going to relate a lot to oxidative stress because I'll be able to go in a little more detail with this. So depression is also linked with mitochondrial dysfunction. Mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell. That's what everybody says. That's what you hear in your high school biology course. They're the powerhouse of the cell because they generate ATP. They actually also generate GTP from what I remember. I'm pretty sure that's right. So yes, it is. But the point is that it produces molecules that the cell uses for energy. So, and the big one is ATP production. So mitochondrial dysfunction, but mitochondria do a lot more than that. They produce energy, sure, but they also control so many different other aspects of the cell. They're incredibly important. So having higher mitochondrial dysfunction is apparently linked or associated with higher levels of depression. So it's characterized, at least partly, by a disrupted oxidative phosphorylation system and impaired mitochondrial ATP production. Okay, so again, I told you this is going to get in the weeds today. It really was. So bear with me again. So the mitochondria, I'm going to give you a little context first. The mitochondria is a system or an organelle that can generate its own reactive oxygen species. So let me go ahead and explain that first. When the mitochondria are generating ATP, I just said that it's a powerhouse of the cell and it produces energy. When it does that, it produces oxidative stress. That might seem counterintuitive because why would your cell create oxidative stress? Well, I'm not going to go into the weeds too much with that, but suffice it to say that oxidative stress isn't always a bad thing. I'll leave it at that. But if you have mitochondrial dysfunction, that's when you have too much oxidative stress, or that's one of the reasons why you might have dysfunction. So this generation of more oxidative stress than your cell can handle leads to this damage of the proteins and the fats and the DNA and all that stuff. So focusing in on how exactly that process works, you have these mitochondria that have 2 membranes. They are enclosed. They're like double insulated. You have an outer membrane and you have an inner membrane. And inside that inner membrane, you have a series of proteins called the oxidative phosphorylation system, or the electron transport chain. And I'm not going to go into all the details of how they function and whatnot, but the point is that these 5 proteins all together generate ATP. They allow for the formation of ATP. And they do that through partly the exchange of electrons. Electrons are a part of an atom. If you've ever seen, I'm sure you have, a periodic table from your chemistry courses, those are all atoms. It's a description of atoms. And they have a particular number of electrons that are associated to each atom. And those electrons are actually what I was talking about earlier. I said I didn't want to get too much into the chemistry. Well, unfortunately, sometimes you kind of have to. But those electrons are what are associated with these with oxidative stress. So this exchange, this kind of unfair exchange of electrons, can lead to oxidative stress. So to detail that a little bit more, when you have these 5 proteins that are generating ATP, sometimes you can get, normally what you would get is these electrons are being passed from one area, from one protein to another protein. And that passage of these electrons actually generates the ability to produce ATP from ADP, so from a lower energy state molecule known as ADP, and we can generate ATP. So that's all done through the exchange of these electrons. There's so much more complexity to this. I'm really trying to keep things as simple as I possibly can, which is tough. But with this exchange of electrons, you can get what's called electron slippage, where electrons can kind of escape their normal pattern. So instead of going one direction, they go a different direction. And with this electron slippage, if these loose electrons interact with oxygen, which is near the mitochondria as well, that can lead to the aforementioned reactive oxygen species. So suddenly these electrons are interacting in an unfavorable way with oxygen molecules, which are then producing these reactive oxygen species. So to tie all of that together, if you're consuming a really high fat diet, which fat goes through the mitochondria and is used to produce ATP, if you're consuming a high fat, and typically it's more so overconsumption of calories in general, you're going to see increased production of ATP. And with that, sometimes it can be so much fat intake and so much caloric intake that the mitochondria are constantly slipping electrons, and they're constantly producing these reactive oxygen species, and they can't generate enough of this of the glutathione peroxidase and enough of the superoxide dismutase to nullify all of these reactive oxygen species, and that's what that can then lead to damage of not only the mitochondria, but of the cell in general. So ultimately what this leads to is it can lead to eventually impaired mitochondrial ATP production. So now the cell not only is being assaulted from all these reactive oxygens, but it can also reduce the energy production of the cell, which is highly detrimental as well. Because once it reaches a certain level, it's going to die. The cell ends up dying off, which you can imagine if that happens in your brain, that's not great. And there is an association, not based off of this review, but based off some other studies that I've read. There is an association between brain atrophy, brain shrinkage, and depression. So if that is one of the mechanisms for why, I don't know, but it would certainly be plausible. So this overall disruption of the system, because of this mitochondrial dysfunction, can lead to reduced neuronal plasticity, which is something I mentioned earlier, as well as reduced neurogenesis, so the reduced production of more neurons, or the interaction between different neurons as well. So neuronal plasticity being that one, both of which are hallmarks of depression. So the evidence of this link between depression and mitochondria have been assessed a really cool way by transplanting functional, healthy mitochondria, so that aren't dysfunctional, into the hippocampus, which is a particular section of the brain that's responsible for memory. of mice. So obviously they can't do this with humans. Who's going to sign up for that? But because that's some pretty intense brain surgery. So they've done this on mice, and they've assessed that these mice are depressed, which I will say, I don't, it's going to be really difficult for, I need to talk to a scientist that actually does this kind of research, because to assess how an animal is depressed, I mean, just the way that they describe it is determined by a swim test. So the less time swimming is considered depressive. A sucrose preference test is another way, which is if they consume less sucrose than sugar, then they tend to be depressed. I don't know. You read those two. They had a few other tests, but those two tests seem... That seems like a wild assumption, but I'm assuming that this has been vetted by other psychiatry and neurology focused researchers. So if we use that as our metrics, let's just put that aside, our doubt about that, or my doubt about that. When they transplanted these functional healthy mitochondria into these mice, they were able to reverse some of the depression that was caused by LPS addition. So what does that mean? LPS is liposaccharide, which is a bacterial protein. And what researchers use that for is to increase inflammation, because obviously if you throw in a bunch of bacterial protein into an area, the body's going to react to that. So they use that as a model for depression and to increase inflammation and to attack the mitochondria. So after they've done that, and after they've done all this damage to the mouse's brain, which is kind of sad but unfortunately something that needs to be done so we can get some of this information, then they transplant mitochondria from healthy mice and move them into the sick mice, and they find that the effects are reversed. How freaking cool is that? That is super cool. Again, putting aside the doubts about their model for depression, or how they determine depression in animals. Okay, so poor diet definitely contributes to mitochondrial dysfunction. That's not a shock. With high-fat diet leading to abnormal mitochondrial biogenesis being the production of more mitochondria, as well as increased free radicals, increased inflammation, and increased insulin resistance. Insulin resistance is definitely something that a lot of people already know, but also can lead to increases in inflammation and free radicals. Free radicals by that mechanism I was telling you about with the electron slippage. And a hypercaloric, so an overconsumption of a high carbohydrate diet, leads to the same pathway, leads to the same exact issues. So it's not a matter of high carb, high fat kind of situation. It's more of we're over consuming, and maybe the quality of the diet may also be playing a factor as well, because if you're getting less of these micronutrients, of these polyphenols, et cetera, that can certainly impact our overall health. So especially in regards to this, mitochondrial dysfunction, oxidative stress, and inflammation, and therefore then potentially causing some issues with depression. So what they've shown is that calorie restriction calorie restriction has been shown to increase mitochondrial biogenesis, so to increase the amount of mitochondria, and that is been measured through increases in citrate synthase. So citrate synthase is a enzyme that is in what's known as the Krebs cycle, or the TCA cycle, and is a key enzyme to allow for the generation of energy in the mitochondria. Fun fact, I actually have done these experiments during my master's program. I did a bunch of citrate synthase experiments. But no studies have looked at calorie restriction on depressive symptoms. So they've done calorie restriction on increasing mitochondrial biogenesis and increasing citrate synthase levels, but they haven't done calorie restriction on depression specifically to see if they can connect all of those together, because depression seems to reduce mitochondrial biogenesis, or poor diet reduces mitochondrial biogenesis, and poor diet seems to be associated with depression as well. Okay, wow. I've been talking for a long time now. I'm so glad that I did not try to cram all of this information from the other 6 things that I wanted to cover into this one podcast. But what are the big takeaways? I understand I talked your ear off with molecular mechanisms. I had a bunch of brain farts trying to explain these concepts kind of on the fly can be really difficult. But hopefully I did some justice. And if you have questions, certainly reach out to me. Okay, so the big takeaway is that diet is related to depressive symptoms. That's one of the big ones. If it's the cause or not is completely unknown, but we know that it's at least associated. But it likely can benefit a person who has depressive symptoms, especially major depressive symptoms, by lessening them. So it seems to have an impact. How does it do that? Well, potentially how can you do that is potentially by caloric restriction. And I imagine there's probably a threshold there, because if you're underweight, don't calorically reduce. Don't do that. But maybe if you're massively overweight, then calorie reduction, which however you end up doing that, leads to weight loss. And of course that has just in terms of like a one nutrition intervention that the person can make, losing weight from being, really overweight to like just losing a little bit of weight has far-reaching effects across your entire body. I mean, above like whatever diet you end up choosing or nutrition style you end up choosing, weight loss is a massive benefit up until a point. Once you become a certain weight, once you become underweight, that is a huge problem. It becomes highly ineffectual and it can hurt you. So, but the point is for this, potentially by caloric restriction, and likely by changing one's diet to more whole foods, less refined foods, polyphenol-filled foods. We talked about curcumin, we talked about blueberries, etc. Vitamin C and vitamin E, focusing on those without going over too much on vitamin E, because that is a fat-soluble vitamin. Selenium, so these different minerals like selenium, zinc, and then this amino acid cysteine consumption all seem to decrease free radicals, reducing oxidative stress, improving mitochondrial function, and reducing inflammation. And all of those are associated with one another in potentially affecting depression. Okay. That's what I've got for you folks. Hopefully you got some information out of that. I sincerely apologize if that some of that went completely over your head. I will try in the future to create more bite-sized pieces, but breaking this podcast up already into like 3 different sections, into 3 different parts I thought was going to be enough, but clearly I can see now that it's going to take more than that. But thanks for bearing with me. I appreciate it. Hopefully you got something out of it. And with that, I hope to have the absolute pleasure, as always, to speak with you in the near future. Have a good one, guys. See ya.